Welcome to Psychologist Talks. This is going to be part 2 in a series about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. Now, today's going to be all about subtypes. I can't remember if in part 1 I was kind of alluding to maybe there was going to be more than just subtypes, but I realized in trying to combine subtypes with development, that turned out to be very lengthy and not necessarily economical as much as they are related. And so we're just going to focus on subtypes today, and it is very possible this will be like a 5-part series, which I chuckle at because I feel silly not anticipating this, but hey, it's the first one in a series. And number 2, narcissistic personality disorder is one of the biggest, and so it makes good sense that it's probably going to take more than just a couple episodes to truly tackle with any degree of thoroughness. So I will do my best to talk about subtypes today. Also, I live next to an air base, so if there's some jets flying around in the background and you're wondering what is that background noise, that is what that's going to be. So let's first revisit. Episode 1 was all about symptoms, conceptualization, priority based on psychodynamic understandings of things, and the central tenets here. I mean, the simplified version of conceptualizing narcissism is there's some insecurity, there's some sort of incompetence, some sort of not measuring up that becomes quite pervasive and quite pathological at the core. And there is a discrepancy because that sort of inadequacy is juxtaposed by an external world that is increasingly seen as powerful and capable of so many things that the person does not have. And they yearn for this. I am weak, I am frail, the world is powerful. And that discrepancy for some people is too much to manage, and the narcissistic defense becomes a handy way to navigate this discrepancy and just flip the switch here and say, no, I will become the powerful one. I will do anything I can to ensure that I retain this belief that I am powerful and perfect. And a la carte, as I gain those things for myself and or associate myself with things that I see as powerful, I will devalue the things or systems or people that threaten that perfection. I have to be perfect to be okay. Now, this is the start point. Underneath any subtype, this fundamental tendency will be there. I can't stress that enough. What we're talking about is the manifestation, the behaviors might look a little bit different. And we'll talk a little bit that there are some underlying differences, but this core key concept will remain the same across the subtypes. So that is the anchor point that we're starting from here. So the subtypes. And I'll also try to pepper in a little bit of like what a higher functioning version might look like. Just so you remember, this is from a psychodynamic lens that there's different functional levels. I have an introductory episode on rethinking or reimagining personality. Engage with that episode if you're a little bit more curious about this whole functional level. But the high level ones skirt under the radar, and a lot of people don't talk about them. So I'll try to add a little bit of gusto and a little bit of description of those folks with each subtype. So without further ado, let us get into the first subtype. So the first subtype is the obvious one. We might not spend a ton of time on it because it's represented everywhere. It is in the diagnostic manual, and that is, as the psychodynamic folks call it, the arrogant and entitled type. And it is exactly as the name sounds. They lead with arrogance, and they feel entitled to everything, which is very transparent. They're really not defending against any aspects of the narcissism. They're kind of front and center with it to a certain degree. Talk about the neurotic folks in a minute. And so they believe and they feel as though they are larger than life and that they deserve and they have all of these powerful and wonderful attributes, and they will let you know that arrogance will not be hidden. Maybe you won't notice it right away, but you will soon understand that they are self-referencing for most things of like, look at me, I'm larger than life, I take up all the space in the room, those sorts of things. These again are the stereotypes that we see in pop culture quite frequently, at least historically. There's not a ton to it. They lead with arrogance. It's right there in front of you. And just look at the diagnostic manual. It's pretty much a perfect description of the arrogant and entitled type. So the neurotic types, though, you might not get you it might not be as obvious. And this is interesting because you might hear me use some language that'll sound like the second subtype we're talking about in a minute. But that arrogance, when it's more neurotic, can come across more in the realm of like specific areas of arrogance. So neurotic individuals are interesting because they can sometimes be quite successful in businesses, quite successful in relationships. And so the arrogance might not show up all the time. This is particularly true if they're in positions of power. And this probably extends beyond the neurotic types. But when narcissism has what it needs, it can play nice. This is more typical of higher functional levels than the lower functional levels, because the lower functional levels is almost like it's never enough. But as you start treading towards the higher levels of functioning, if they are in positions of power and authority and are esteemed, that can quell the insecurities, and so the arrogance becomes less obvious. I often say this to leaders. This is interesting overlap. I'm not saying leaders are narcissists, but what I often say to leaders is like the true test of your abilities as a leader are not when things are good. It is when things are challenging, and the narcissistic defense is no exception. When things are going well and you have a bunch of power and esteem and those sorts of things, it's easy to kind of let the water just slide right off your back if right off the feathers if you're in a good position. You can take in a little bit of feedback. Oh yeah, because it doesn't threaten that arrogance at the core. It doesn't threaten that sense of perfection, because the little slights here and there pale in comparison to all the other achievements and accolades and those sorts of things. So when people are challenged, though, and that power, that sense of authority is threatened, that is when the more higher level of organization folks might start to show their colors, and they might posture more, and they might kind of puff up their chest and get a little bit aggressive or a little bit defensive, in the service of preserving what they know is true about themselves, of how great they are, etc., etc. And so we still have to look for trends and tendencies. Everybody can get a little bit defensive. I mean, I don't know about y'all, when I feel like I've lost something and that people don't really see me for who I am, and I just feel really derailed, whether it's over a week or some sort of project or something like that, there's a part of me that goes like, no, I don't want to be represented this way. I don't want to be seen this way. And so I might get a little bit defensive on the front end, or maybe it'll build, and after the fifth time I hear some sort of feedback, I'm just like, no, boom, and I just put a stop to it because it's just hurting too much. This is different though. This is about consistency. When there is a threat to their ego, they will start to consistently show this defense of valuing and inflating oneself, but then also devaluing whatever is threatening them. So again, it can be a little bit more subtle, but the arrogant and entitled type, they have a hard time hiding it because of that arrogance. That arrogance is, I think, a more transparent thing, especially as social norms, treading slightly into gender, change, where arrogance is not really seen as an asset as much anymore. There's seems to be certain groups of people that tend to still esteem arrogance, but we seem to be doing a better job overall, not sort of celebrating arrogance, particularly in men. So that's the arrogant entitled type. It doesn't probably beg of too much more explanation. Number 2 is the more interesting one, but it's also the more dangerous one. This is the covert narcissist. It has several names: the shy narcissist, the injured narcissist. And let me start with why it's dangerous. Because it is covert, it is less obvious, as the name implies, and a little bit less arrogance. But the narcissistic defense is essentially hiding below a few feet of soil. And why this is so dangerous: it allows lay people to lump anybody who gets defensive as a narcissist. Now, I'm not saying people are wrong all the time, but because there's this covertness to it and this grayness to it, it's dangerous in the hands of lay people who don't know what they're talking about and will just conveniently suggests that when someone is challenging interpersonally, that they could be narcissistic. And I've seen this on both ends of the fence, both people claiming this of other people, and as a provider, while I've not met that other person, I'm sitting there going like, that I don't know if that's computing, but I've also met very frequently the parents of the people who are accused. And I'm not saying they don't have their issues. They're coming to see me for, working through various things. But it's super sad when they're labeled as narcissists. I'm sitting there going like, no, I'm like a pro at personality issues. Like, this is my jam, and this is not that. This is not that. So the long and the short of it is, before we get into the descriptions here in a short minute, don't diagnose people in your life. I mean, hopefully I made that clear through various instances, whether through description of the channel or otherwise. I'm not giving diagnostic advice, and I don't want and I don't encourage people to be diagnosing people in their lives. It is what I hope is it's empowering to see patterns. Say if you're a lay person, you can see patterns around you and then use those patterns to identify problems that you want to address. You don't have to name it and diagnose it though. But if you're noticing these tendencies that I'm talking about in all these episodes, then it's something to be curious about and okay, so how do I act and seek to improve or interrupt this unhealthy process that I'm seeing around me? Don't throw labels. Labels are not helpful. They're just not going to be helpful. I'm sorry. Let the providers deal with that. So there's my little stump speech. My apologies. And I hope that's not invalidating, because I know there are people out there who straight up have dealt with narcissistic individuals, and even if they're not diagnosed, it's important to say, I think that's what it is, so that way you can kind of separate and be like, I don't want to take that blame anymore. I get that, and I'm not trying to undo that. We just need to be more careful as a society before we're just willy-nilly calling people and naming people into these categories. Hopefully that makes sense. Being responsible. So what is this covert type? Well, as the name implies, it's less obvious. It's less in your face. And the reason is they defend against the arrogance. Whereas the arrogant and entitled, you're going to see that arrogance, boom, just kind of bust out at worst case scenario when they're challenged. If not, it's always there to a certain degree. The covert types do a good job defending against this. They sort of subvert it or they sort of bury it to a certain degree. So it's underneath those few feet of soil. You're not going to hit the defense right away. The kind of silly imagery or sort of mentality that I give people is, imagine as you get to know people, you dig a few feet below the surface. When we first meet people, it's just what's on top of the soil. As we get to know them, and we dig and we get more intimate, we get below the surface. We start seeing what's underneath there. With narcissism, though, you go digging, right? Digging along. Oh, interesting. Oh, that's interesting. You get more and more intimate, and then clink, you're going to hit some metal. And you're like, that's weird. I hit some metal. Well, maybe this is just like an area I don't need to dig in. And then you go somewhere else, start digging. Okay, let's see what clink. Is that metal again? And the idea is, it doesn't matter where you dig, you're going to hit metal. You're not going to get to the core here. You're not going to get all the way down. It's just the narcissistic defense is hidden at first. So you think you can dig. With an overt, transparently narcissistic individual, you probably don't want to dig. You understand from the get-go, there ain't going to be no digging here. The covert types, they could trick you, though. And you're like, you get to know them a little bit and get to dig a little bit. But when you go digging, you ain't going to get very far before you start hitting the metal. That is all the same. All the same. It's there just like everything else. They're just hiding that arrogance better. Now, this can look different for different folks. So even within the covert, there's different sort of mentalities or different ways it can show up. Covert ones that I think are really tricky for folks are the ones that don't really show any injury, but they tend to relate relatively well. And I really wonder if this is talking... Well, no, I think there's neurotic on both ends of the fence, but this is especially true for the more neurotic individuals, the higher levels of functioning, the higher level functional level, they're fine until greater intimacy is challenged of them, and or they need to receive some sort of feedback that maybe they're not the greatest partner or the greatest boss in the world. And so everything's hunky-dory because as long as you like them and you're having fun and things are going well and needs are being met, yay, things are wonderful. But then it's like, well, yeah, but you don't listen to me. Or it feels like you don't really see and understand me. Or it feels like you blame me a lot for what's going wrong here. And that's where they will misdirect you and say, no, that's not the case. Then you bring it up again, no, that's not the case. And then you're like, well, what is the case then? Well, I really do care about you. Well, are you hearing me though? Can you explain why I'm having this experience? Like they will not validate the experience. They'll try to quell your anxieties and go, oh no, that's not it. And if you really start to crack and you really get into that metal and you keep hitting the metal like clink, 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 you're like, what is this? Let me through. Then they might get a bit angry and a bit defensive. And that's where an overused, but it's totally a thing that happens, but it's an overused term. That's where gaslighting can come into play. Where they're like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're the one who's always flying off the handle. And when you fly off the handle, what am I supposed to do about that? Like they'll make it about something else. They'll make it about a behavior. They'll make it about some sort of if-then, but never really addressing the core of what you're trying to offer them, because that's the dangerous piece. That's the part that's going to threaten their sense of security, their sense of identity. They're not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. They're not going to about to validate that, because if they validate that, that means they have to respond to it. If they have to respond to it, that means they have to acknowledge that they did something wrong, and that is very, very tough for them to really handle. So that covertness, they'll kind of try to get you away from that metal at first by convincing you nothing's wrong, but once you start clinking, that's where they can get angry, defensive, and really push back pretty hard, threaten. Could be the kind of lower organizational levels, but probably some can be threatening, but threaten also in the sense of like leaving a relationship, or this all come crashing down if we continue this process. So now what's really interesting is that's like the one that's things are fine until they're not. What's really interesting is the more injured types, and these will actually lead with a little bit of vulnerability first. And that's what really, really throws people off as well, because they'll talk to you and they will come in to see me and talk about how they are injured, how they are, just like so put upon in this world. And you might have initial sympathy for them. I pause on that because, I sometimes struggle is like, is the sympathy and empathy warranted, or is this a manipulation? I would like to think, one, it varies, but I would like to think there's a little bit of sympathy, because I don't think that they're overtly lying. We'll talk about a subtype, or it was one of the two side ones that this could be represented by. But I think some of it is legitimate. A certain degree of it is legitimate. I've definitely met people where it's like, no, they are offering something. It's just whatever they're offering, it's like the substance that seeps through the defense into the soil. And so when you're digging, you will find some of this like insecurity in the soil, but it's not being let out a bunch. And the soil itself almost distorts it. It becomes kind of oily. It's not really it's like insecurity with an asterisk, right? It's like, it's insecurity, but it's tainted. It's tainted by the narcissistic defense. As it came up through that metal and through the soil, it has become tainted from its original source. And so it's not fully to be trusted. But there is some legitimacy to it, I would argue, especially at the neurotic levels. The neurotic levels, they can come in with legitimate pain. However, when you're digging around, well, let me help you with this, you will clink, hit the metal. And so I'll give you an illustration of what this might sound like, is people might come in as a provider, or they might talk to you in a sense of, feeling really injured and very down on oneself, like, and this is also very frequently comes up when there's not enough successes in their life. It's really interesting when you get people who have success and do this, but more often there's a lack of success. They've trying things and they're just not getting to where they want to be, and so they will talk about, I just don't feel good about myself. I feel like I'm a failure. I feel like I'm not measuring up. or I feel like I'm just not good in relationships and people don't like me. And you'll go, oh, geez, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's understand it and try to move towards workable space to improve upon it. But when you're trying to get to that workable space and really explore it, it will be quick. You will quickly hit the metal, and they will contradict themselves. They will say that I am not worth much, and yet sit there and go, you know what, I am worth quite a bit, I think. There is something really special and unique about me. And if I hadn't been dealt this sort of raw deal in life, I would be doing better than I am right now. It's other people, right, that have gotten me into this position. If this hadn't had happened to me, I would be way better than this. And you know what? If they really slip up, they'll say, they will straight up devalue, and they'll say, you know what? And I don't think most people could get me anyway. I'm too smart. I'm too intelligent. And people are purposely trying to suppress me because they're threatened by my greatness and what I'm capable of doing. And so get this sudden externalization where you're like, whoa, I weren't we just talking about like how worthless you were? But here we are. Like suddenly I find myself not empathizing with you as much as a provider because you're like, this is just not going to be for kids. I'm just like shitting on people all of a sudden. And part of you wants maybe, if they're doing a good job with this defense, maybe wants a high five, like, yeah, you assert yourself, you stand up for yourself. But then there's another part that feels icky doing that because you're like, there's a difference between like, I don't need to take in everybody's feedback, and that maybe there are people in this world who don't fully understand me, and I can't base my sense of self-worth on that. There's something all-encompassing about their phrasing and their ideology, where the best case scenario, they're vacillating between this seeming or alleged insecurity and this othering and devaluing of the world around them as a means of self-preservation. But none of that is workable space. None of that is really getting them to a point of actually wanting to improve upon themselves. And that is where you can get really stuck from a treatment lens of just like, what do I do with this person? Because they're saying one thing, but they are just like, they seem almost full of themselves and just hateful towards most of the world. All these things that are making them feel devalued. That is that more injured type. Once again, on the neurotic level, you're not going to see this as pervasively. There's sort of a lighter presentation of it. The neurotic covert types are probably the most fascinating because these are people who are chronically injured by the world around them. Nothing is ever enough. And so they'll speak a lot to depressivity and feeling down and unsure. And it's every single time something doesn't go quite right. And they will struggle through that, through bits of depression and then the bits of like, no, I'm really good. But remember, depressive individuals do this very similarly, but what they're not doing in that process is employing the narcissistic defense so pervasively, so rigidly, and devaluing things in the process of like, well, I'm going to climb myself out of this insecurity by climbing on and shoving other people down so I can be on top. It's not like I need to find my place. I'm happy here. There's a few people I don't want to listen to. It's like, no, I can't be the worst. I am great. I will reclaim this greatness and I will climb on other people to reclaim this greatness. That is that cycle of injured then it's like, no. And then it's injured again. And then it's no. I am good. I am perfect. So that's where it gets really tricky. And that's where I think a lot of mislabeling happens. That there's other insecure and there's other insecurities and other personality-related issues that are going on that better account for this insecurity, as well as trying to like work through and build one's sense of esteem and self back up to a more functional level. That is not narcissism. And we'll go into different personality constructs another time. So that's the covert. Covert, it's tricky. It can be anywhere from a snake in the grass to just really confusing, discombobulated people who are struggling with a narcissistic defense, and you're just not going to get hit it right away because there's lots of other stuff between them and the defense, the outer shell and the defense underneath. Yeah, so those are the big two: arrogant, entitled, and the covert, injured, shy, narcissistic type. So there's two others. These are more rare, and they're also more extreme. And this will tread us into the developmental episode, because there's something causal underneath that's causing the excess here. That's causing the excessiveness and the danger of these approaches. So let's flip back. Arrogant, entitled, and then we're going to go into one that kind of leans more heavily in that direction. And then we've got that covert, shy, injured, and then we'll lean one that heads further in that direction too, towards the extremes. That's the best way I conceptualize it, at least. So the worst version, and I'm just going to blatantly say that, I don't care if that sounds stigmatizing, because these folks are pretty dangerous, are the malignant narcissist. This takes arrogance and entitlement and just injects it with rocket fuel. The way I kind of describe sometimes this arrogant and entitlement is, at the end of the day, if they are given a choice between themselves and somebody else, they will always choose themselves. And I think this is a really important point, because it's not like they're so malicious all the time. Lower functional levels can get more malicious, transactional, really using people. But as you're floating into mid-level and above, they will sometimes do that. But there's also plenty of circumstances where it's when they're confronted with this choice that they make the choice. This is different than malignant, because malignant, there is never a choice to begin with. There is no choice. It is always them, and they will lead with them, and they won't wait for something to become a choice. Like, that's how pervasive, how malignant this process is. It doesn't matter if they're family, it doesn't matter if they're blood. You are going to be on the chopping block if you get anywhere close to thwarting their power. And with that, they will actively use people, absolutely use people. And one of the arguments is that, especially when we're thinking from a more dimensional lens, these folks are treading actually closer to an antisocial personality disorder. So they represent sort of a gray zone between antisocial and narcissism. And with it, I think I mentioned in part one, it's like one of the qualifiers in the diagnostic manual was an unwillingness to engage in empathy. Whereas when we're talking about malignance, we start wondering about an incapability of empathy. It's just not on their radar, and it will not be on their radar. And with that, treatment of these individuals is quite precarious, because you don't want to teach them to manipulate better. It's the same thing we talk about with true blue antisocial, not the misdiagnosed folks who actually just have conduct issues. But truly, the ones who struggle with empathy and use people, you do not want to teach them how to empathize, because they're just going to flip that around and be like, oh, so that's how I trick people into thinking I'm empathizing when I'm not. Cool. And with that, you do not want them in any positions of power. I don't care if it's parenthood, because parenthood is power to any other system. You do not want them to touch authority with a 10-foot pole, because they will ruin it. It is guaranteed they will ruin it and destroy it to serve their own needs. Do they every once in a while make things and secure things okay if it's serving their needs? Yeah. But you don't want to play that game of roulette. You do not. You're going to lose that game every single time, because it's whatever behooves them. I shouldn't say behooves, benefits them and preserves them. So very, very dangerous folks, and rarer. You more typically get the arrogant, entitled at lower functional levels, where they're just resistant to change, and they're not going to self-direct into treatment either. But when you start getting into low empathy, using everybody as a tool, be careful. Be careful. On the flip side, so that's like kind of the arrogant, entitled going towards the extreme. If we apply kind of the same mentality, but to the covert side, we get what are called parasitic narcissists. Now, these folks are dangerous because, how I was talking about, like, maybe there's some legitimacy to that insecurity in the injured type. The parasitic types, it's pure vitriol, it's pure oil, because the premise, I think, is that, again, empathy is low, and they're using people as tools, but the mechanism through which they use people is through illness and through being small and fragile and weak, or creating weakness around them that they can then exploit. The one that I'm most familiar with, I see it just seems to be possible, like maybe I'm missing a subtype or a component of parasitic narcissism. But the one that I'm most familiar with is the one that will come into your office absolutely claiming depression and will flail about very freely. The injured type will flirt with it and go, yeah, I'm not doing so well. Whereas the parasitic type will be like, I just can't. And they threaten suicide. They do all sorts of things to suggest to you how weak and frail they are, and that you have to understand that they are weak and frail, which you would think is like antithetical to the narcissistic defense, but it's because they've learned that that's how they can derive power and meet the needs that they need. So they give up on these grandiose fantasies that I'm going to be the best thing in the world. Instead, they take small groups or select individuals and systems and feed off of them. I am broken and frail, and you need to support me at all costs. And if you try to challenge me to get better, I will show you how broken I am. And the minute you give me that latitude to be like, yep, they're pretty broken, I will use and manipulate all the resources around me to make sure I'm getting my little selfish needs met. Now, the point though, is it's still little, right? These kind of grandiose fantasies of larger than life and endless success, the diagnostic criteria we talked about in episode 1, part 1, it's so fascinating because they keep it so narrow, right? They'll just play video games all day, or they'll spend all the money on things that they really enjoy. And the minute they're challenged, yeah, and I'll play the sick role here for a little bit more, and I'm just not. It's just I tried. I know don't get mad at me. I'm sorry. I'm trying. And then eventually it just forces people like, oh no, I know you're trying. I'm sorry. Okay, good. And then they go about using the system further. So it's probably the most fascinating because it's the most perverted sort of manifestation of the defense. Like they keep it going, but the loops or the hoops, sorry, that they have to jump through to preserve it are just endlessly fascinating. So those are the subtypes. We're, again, arrogant, entitled, covert. Then we got the extremes, the poles, the malignants, and the parasitic. Hopefully this has been an interesting foray. We'll jump into developments and other aspects that build off of these first 2 parts. And yeah, hope it's been helpful. And as ever, stay curious.